Let's start at the beginning. Honestly, I'm not sure how many of you even know the artist, or if you're here just out of mild curiosity, or if you're really involved in art enough to know who David Hockney is, I guess. So he was born just before the war in Britain and remembers the bombing at age 4 and 5 years old and hiding under the stairs while bombs were dropping around. He remembers those days and grew up in a post-war working class northern England town of Bradford. His father was a anti-nuke advocate and a bit of a militant, and the militancy came out in David as he grew older. And David was determined from a very young age to be an artist, and to the sort of bane of his folks, would always be drawing on every scrap of paper wherever he could find it, even in class and on books, and getting in trouble constantly because all he wanted to do was draw. And of course his folks thought, you know, there's no future in this for you. But he showed certainly an aptitude, and by his teenage years was drawing daily. And Jordan's very fortunate to have in his collection the very first print that David ever made, hanging by the front door there, which is a little self-portrait that he did at about the age of 16 or 17 years old, where he made a mess in the living room, making prints against his mother's wishes, and he's never stopped. The first thing he did was, after he started looking at art, he started painting his neighborhood, painting, you know, the houses and roads and whatever of Bradford. And his first foray to a big museum where he saw his first Van Gogh, he understood that, wow, there's color in the world. And so each step of the way he was able to become more empowered with his want and ability to draw and paint. Since those days, and after becoming, let's say, a real professional artist, David really further explored the way we see the world. And in every picture he's ever made, it's really about putting you, the viewer, in the picture. Not looking at something on the wall, but bringing you into that environment of that image. And it's a struggle or a pursuit that he's always had. And to this day is still trying to put you there so that you're standing in front of that tree and you can reach out and grab the blossom. I mean, he really does focus on making that an aspect of your experience with looking at the image. Now, in the case of printmaking, David, being a fanatical artist, would draw and work in a way always pushing the envelope and exploring new technology. So right off the bat, when he was at the Royal College in London and making paintings and earning his degree and his diploma, he was a poor working class boy from Bradford and didn't really have the money to buy all that expensive canvas and paintbrushes and paints. But up on the third floor where the print room was, the paper was free, the ink was free, the etching plates were provided. So he suddenly could make prints, could draw and make prints and not spend any money. So it was a way for him to really access art, the making of artwork right away. And after those initial 3 lithographs that he made at home, once he got to art school in London, he first attacked etching, because those were the tools that he was provided with. So he really not only got into etching, he really got into etching and really understood the medium and would draw and erase and draw again and throw away one plate and move on to another plate. So a few of those early etchings are here, including the center piece, if you look to your left, that center small vertical in a white frame. That's among his very first etchings that he did at the Royal College in London, probably his third image. And at the time, David was then, by that time, he was into his 20s, 22, 23 probably. In Britain, post-war, you had to do 2 years of public service, and David spent his 2 years not carrying a gun, but instead working in a hospital in Manchester, cleaning bedpans. So by the time he got to the Royal College, he was eager to make art and eager to get started. But he also was starting to come into his own personally, and understanding that he was homosexual and was not really interested in women. And so that experience in college with other peers his age, with the, let's say, the awakening of their own lives, was able to live his life authentically, and it's illustrated through his art. So you see little hints from these early prints of him sort of coming out of the closet to not only his peers, but to his professors, to Greater London, and it put him sometimes in a little bit of hot water. I mean, it was an illegal thing, but so he was sort of walking a tightrope of bad boyness in presenting this stuff, but he was very bold about it and was confronted early on, asked directly the question, and his answer was, so what? Do you like my art? It was like, do you love life? Who cares? So he sort of brushed it off from a very early age, which gave him tremendous inner confidence to continue his work. So because this is a print exhibition with etching, with lithography, and with these newer technologies that David's exploring, including making prints with a Canon color copier. When it was invented in the late 80s, he was one of the first people to have a Canon color copier delivered to the studio so that he could make prints by making copies. He would place things on the glass, he would paint on the glass, he would put a sock on the glass, and he would run the paper through creating textures, and he would run the paper through again with a different color. And so he created these prints on a copy machine. So he was always pushing the technology of what was available so that he could draw and make an image that put you in the picture space. This group of lithographs on this wall he calls them the moving perspective, the moving focus. Clearly, there's an influence of Picasso, and the center portrait shows Gregory Evans sitting in a chair with his legs crossed, but the upper half of the portrait, his body is twisted the other way, but his head is twisted. It's very Picasso the way that's broken up, because your experience of seeing a person isn't static. You're standing there, you're looking at them sideways, they move, they cross their leg, they take a drag on their cigarette, and all of that is illustrated in the image so that it's a time frame of looking at someone, not just a snapshot like a photograph. David is, even though he uses photography in the work, he's always been against photography because it takes you out of the picture. It's a picture of something over there. It's not a picture you're in. So with his own drawing as photography as drawing, which are illustrated on those 4 pieces over there, you're standing in that studio with that group of people. He tries to bring that eye to you so that you're in that picture, not looking at something on the wall. You're standing there next to that guy, next to the orange chair. And those are fascinating the way they're made, which gives them that high detail in the far distance and high detail in the near distance, whereas a single photograph would fall out of focus the further back you go. But in those pictures, every corner of the image is in sharp focus the way your eye would see it, typically. So he tries to bring you into the image. And the technological, I can certainly answer in questions how it's done, but the goal visually is to experience the space yourself and not be looking from a distance at something. There are master printmakers that help artists do what they imagine. So this is an example of a print that was done in the late 60s with the master printer called Ken Tyler when he started a workshop in Los Angeles. And this is an early example of their working together, and the 3 pieces on the wall over there is a 10, 12-year later example of their working together. But the difference between these two, and that she can talk further about lithography, lithography was invented in the late 1798 or something like that, and its purpose was propaganda and advertising and a way of making the same image multiple times and spreading it around. Toulouse-Lautrec used lithography to make all of those posters for the dance clubs in Paris. Lithography is typically a crayon or a waxy crayon on a smooth, hard stone. You draw the image, you take water and like a bucket of water and bathe it over so that the stone is wet, and then you take a roller with ink and you roll the ink over the stone, but it only sticks to those crayoned areas and not where the water is. So then when you put a piece of paper on that stone, it picks up the ink. So that's how you get a lithograph. So that lithograph is not printed on a stone, it's printed from a metal. This particular master printer showed David how he could draw on a piece of aluminum and get the same result. So it was an advance in lithography. These pieces are the same master printer who described to David how he could draw on a piece of mylar, like the clear plastic chair you're sitting in, so that he could see one layer above the other as he drew on the different layers of mylar, so he could see the image, and then he'd print from that. So this master of printmaking helped David push the envelope and understand new technologies. Did I say it all, or did I? Okay. Julie wants to talk about the print that David did on the death of Picasso. So this is a good time to bring Julie in. When Picasso died in 1973, David was invited to take part in a portfolio to pay homage to Picasso. So Julie can talk further about the print that's hanging at the end of the wall down there.
So we see Hockney working in a very old medium here. And just first to orient you with what we're looking at, as Doug mentioned, this is a print from the year that Picasso died, 1973. And it's titled The Artist Homage to Picasso. It was made for a print portfolio that was published on the occasion of Picasso's death. So several artists contributed prints to pay tribute to this great artist. So that's really, in a very literal sense, what this image depicts. We see an artist who's holding a drawing portfolio. This is Hockney himself, and he's looking at this head of Picasso on an antique plinth. So truly it's an image of Picasso as an idol in the truest sense. What's interesting to think about on the level of technique, though, is, as I mentioned, etching is normally where you're incising lines into a metal plate. That's how a normal etching is made. But for this print, Hockney actually worked with a printer who had worked closely with Picasso, who developed, so the printmaker had taught Picasso a technique called the sugar lift etching. And that's the medium of this work. So Hockney is adopting a special medium of etching that Picasso himself had mastered. And what's special about the sugar lift etching is that it allowed the artist to paint with a brush onto the plate. Normally, the materials that are used in etching, the chemical materials, wouldn't allow for this. It would actually eat the brush before you could get really anything down. But by modifying that chemical substance, the artist was able to use a brush to paint on the plate, as opposed to having to use an etcher's needle and actually incise lines. You can imagine this is very different. The feeling of incising a line into a metal plate is a very precise, you have to proceed with a level of precision, caution. It's a real pain to reverse an error in that medium. But with a painter's brush, it was just a much more gestural and immediate way of representing in the medium of etching. And I think that's interesting in this work because it really is an homage to an artist that Hockney engaged with throughout his life. And the fact that he was able to achieve that in this more immediate kind of painterly and gestural mode, to me, is just a very nice idea. I want to just talk for one more second about a work that Doug already spoke to. So just to add a couple of things, if we think of that work as a kind of earlier and very literal example of Hockney's engagement with the legacy of Cubism and specifically Picasso, we can look at a work like this from just over a decade later as showing Hockney engaging with Cubism at a much higher level. We see stylistically it really has the look of a Cubist work with this fragmentation and reassemblage style. Just a couple things that I want to add is that in normal lithography, in order to print in colors, you would have to actually make separate stones, multiple stones for each color, so one stone for each color. And the way you would print those colors would be simply by using the same piece of paper and passing it through the press several times. So again, this is extremely painstaking. You have to position these things exactly right so that the layering is exactly right. It's a very cumbersome and studio-bound process. One of the things that Hockney was interested in doing with the help of Ken Tyler was bringing lithography out into the world so that he could work on his designs outside of the studio. So Doug mentioned the Mylar sheets, this is an example of that Mylar lithography technique. Some of the moving focus series to which this work belongs were actually completed when Hockney's car was broken down in Mexico and he was staying at a hotel. And as you're walking around, you'll see that some of the moving focused images actually show that hotel that he was staying in. So that's just an anecdote to give you a sense of the portability and kind of spontaneity that this modification of the lithography medium allowed for. Just one more point about this as a portrait. This is a representation of Gregory Evans, who's a close friend of Hockney's even today. And at a certain point, they were romantic partners, so they have a very long and complex relationship. This portrait was made at a time when the two were not particularly close. They were in a kind of fraught moment in their relationship, and Hockney actually called this his farewell to Gregory. I think that's interesting because one of the things that drew Hockney to specifically to Cubist portraits was that he found that it was a very intimate mode of seeing, is what he called. Cubist portraiture is like a very intimate mode of seeing. There's something about this style that allows you to have a kind of intimacy with the sitter because you're never actually just seeing them represented. You almost have to kind of circle around them and try to get at something essential, right? So yeah, I think we see here that kind of potentially the kind of fraught combination between a portrait that is very intimate with the sitter kind of touching his face. Obviously, as Doug mentioned, this is a portrait that was made over time, so they're sitting together for several hours making this portrait. So there's an intimacy there, and at the same time in the bottom half of the image you notice that Gregory's legs are crossed in a somewhat formal position and his hands are resting on the chair, so there's also a sense of not being fully intimate, not being fully relaxed. That's something that I find really interesting about this image, is that kind of fraught aspect of it in terms of the intimacy that this portrait contains. So thank you very much.
In 2010, the iPad was invented, and the Brushes application, the Brushes app, was improved so that you could take a stylus and draw on the screen directly on the iPad and make your images. So since 2010, David has not put down his iPad and his stylus, and to this day, including today, still draws this way. I mean, it's a drawing tablet that, because it's a light screen, you know, you can draw in the dark, you can draw in the early morning, you can draw in the middle of the day and still see what you're drawing. So he could lie in bed and draw. And as a now 80-year-old, that's a wonderful thing to be able to do. You know, you hear about Matisse, in his old age using scissors and cutting paper and making collages in bed because he was pretty old and feeble. David isn't that old and feeble, but still, he can now draw in bed. And drawing on a pad with paper, which he still does, you really kind of need the daylight, or you need light to see. But now the iPad means you can draw anytime. So, so these drawings are done on an iPad, and technology allows you. The technology allows you to draw on the iPad and then make it this big, because Epson created a printer that's this big with 20 colors of ink. So you get incredible color that you wouldn't get in a 4-color, old-fashioned Canon color copier. Suddenly, the window has gotten bigger. So you can see the technology from that to that is quite distinct, 20 years later. So David is always pushing the edge of technology and what it can do for him as a drawing tool, as a way of drawing, because he draws every day, and that's all he does is draw since a kid. So here we have David spent a good decade from 2003 to 2010, 2012 in his, after having lived in Los Angeles for the last 4 decades, went back when his mother was on her last legs and bought a little house in Bridlington on the coast where his sister was living, looking after mom. And he took his iPad with him and started drawing the countryside around his birthplace. So suddenly he was reliving Bradford again, but this time closer to York and in the Yorkshire County area known as the Wolds or Woldgate. There's a road going through the Wolds called Woldgate. So these are Woldgate pictures, and he drew as the spring was arriving because suddenly he was confronted with seasons again. California, I like to say Los Angeles has 2 seasons, daylight savings and not daylight savings. So that can get, after 40 years, that can get kind of monotonous. So going back to Britain, suddenly he had snow again and the fall and spring color. And that was a bit of a shock. I mean, LA, we do have seasonal trees and things there, but to see it, and to feel the 30 degrees and the 70 degrees, you don't really get that in LA. So that became a great influence to him. So he would drive down the same road through the countryside pretty much. And this had been a tree that was chopped down in February. So you get that sort of bare, cold February look with the tree chopped down and the brush. And then he came back down the same road in March and drew it again. This is early morning with a pink dawn sky. And then he came back again in April when it's starting to sprout and the brush has been cleared. And then May, as it's really starting to fill out towards summer. So you see 4 months of the same tree, essentially, and rendered the way I suppose Monet would have rendered, the facade of the Rouen Cathedral. So that's a terrific suite of 4 prints, but using the new technology of an iPad and printed on an Epson printer because the paper is this big, so let's print it as big as we can. And there you have it. And
tell him how he makes these.
Well, the printer, he now has about, I think he probably has 4 or 5 Epson printers in the studio now, and apparently they now have them 54 inches wide. So he's actually, bought the next biggest one, but it's an array of inks. The paper is also an Epson paper. There's 10 different varieties, but this is a hard white paper, so it's a good flat paper that takes the ink really well and is color fast. Apparently they're very good, strong inks that are supposed to last. So we'll see in 30 years, but I suspect that they will. They'll keep that color vibrancy for years because the technology has really allowed them to get good color and good resilient on a surface that is buffered, that won't get acidic, that won't turn yellow. All of these things that new technology has allowed. So these should stay bright and colorful like this for a very, very, very long time. His association with Ken Tyler started, in the 60s at Gemini, but then when Ken opened his own workshop, he invited David to come and make work that, again, was sort of pushing the envelope. At first, David was like, no, I don't want to do it. Ken's like, I'm going to do something with paper, raw paper pulp, gloppy paper. We dye the paper and we make the image using colored paper. And David at first was like not interested, but when he got there, he made these sunflower pieces first, and he liked it and ended up staying 6 months because he had such a good time doing it. So these were the first experiments using the gloppy paper. So then he focused, Ken Tyler had a pool on the grounds there in Mount Kisco. So he focused on the pool, so this is glopped paper that he put into form, so he's essentially drawing with paper. So that's what these represent. And then a year later came back and actually made a series of traditional lithographs of the pool that he had been making out of paper. So here, these have become a very celebrated group of works because David lived in California for so long and always was associated with his pools and the splash and the lawn being sprinkled, these things. For him to actually render a pool was sort of almost expected, but at the same time, everybody wants a David Hockney pool painting, okay, whatever, fine. So this is one of about 6 or 8 images that he made of that view of the pool, but each one done slightly different with more color or less color or different colors. But the title of this piece, which I think is more telling than actually seeing an image of the pool, is that it's called A Lithograph of Water, made with 2 blue washes, a green wash, and lines, in other words. And then the next one is a lithograph of water made with 2 lines, a green wash, and a blue, So, but the focus of the title is that he's rendering water. That's the whole point of this. The fact that it's a pool with a board, whatever. He's trying to draw water in a way that you're diving into that. That you can feel its wetness, that you're a part of, that you're in the water. And that was, in some way, so well rendered that it became almost a little trademark for him, the way he sort of animated the surface of the water, these lines. So when he got home from this project, he painted the bottom of his pool with these little squiggly lines and then filled it up with water. So you saw the squiggly lines in the pool. And I think Jordan took some photos of the pool on the piano so you can see those. And then, here's actually this was a lithograph that was, an etching that was made for the Museum of Contemporary Art when it first opened in Los Angeles in 1984. They invited 8 artists to make a portfolio to raise money for the new museum. So this was David's contribution to that portfolio. And it's a picture of his backyard with the pool, a couple of branches, a couple of the banana plants that he has. This is the railing of the terrace right outside his bedroom, looking back toward the other side where the living room is. So you're looking across the pool to the other side of the house. And actually Jordan brought some photos of the house so you kind of get in context what that is. The house is in the Hollywood Hills, just off Mulholland, built on a slope. So you actually enter at the garage level and then down a stairway to the front door and then down another stairway to the pool. So the house is sort of terraced down the hillside and now completely surrounded by trees and whatever, and extremely private. And then on the tennis court at the top of the property, he built the studio. So the tennis court is gone and the studio is there. So the studio actually is on those photographs at the other side of the gallery, which we can look at. Any questions? Yeah, we can go down there. Jordan has some really special, considering we're only looking at 50 of the 280 or whatever that are hanging, he really does have little gems in this collection, including this piece at the front door, which is David's first print, 1954. He was a 17-year-old probably. And he did this literally on the living room floor and irked his mother. It's a lithograph done in the traditional way in 3 colors. There's a magenta color, a yellow ochre color, and black. That's it. And it's a self-portrait of David in his natural English black hair. It wasn't until he got to New York City in 1961 on a summer vacation that he actually dyed it blonde and left it that way because is it true blondes have more fun? He literally saw a Clairol commercial. He was first time in New York, first time in America. He's having a blast. He's met a couple of guys and they're watching TV. Is it true blondes have more fun? So they bolt to the pharmacy on the corner. They get bleach blonde and they take it back to the apartment and they bleach their hair. And David never went back to black. He left his hair blonde for the rest of his life, which is really amusing. So this print was done literally in the house. He's a high school kid. Making art, drawing on everything, drawing on the newspaper, driving his parents crazy, making a mess in the living room. And he pulled 5 examples of this print. When you think about it, that's not very many. And to be able to know that David owns one of those prints, that one of those prints is in the Tate Museum collection, one of those prints is in the MoMA collection, and the other print was given to his mother. So I guess to appease her because he'd made such a mess. So this print hung in David's house, even after he left home and moved off to LA. This print hung in David's house for decades. And when his mother passed away, his little brother took the print home and decided to let it go. And I told Jordan that he had to have this or I would not forgive him because this is really, this is definitely a standout print in the collection. And Jordan's extremely lucky to have it. And I hope this travels a lot and folks like you get to see it all over the country because usually the museums have it locked up and put on in storage someplace and you don't get to see it that often, only in special shows. So this is a great print to have in the collection. This is the latest work of David that Jordan has on the wall. These are from 2015. I forget. These are from 2014. So these are 2014. So David had spent most of the 2000s in London and Bridlington in northern in Yorkshire. And when he came back to Los Angeles in 2013, he had closed the studio in Yorkshire and came back to his house in LA. He had been painting the landscape for 10 years, and he came back to LA and sort of, he would come back to LA, because because his studio and his, everything he does is stored in LA. He would come back, once a year, twice a year to take care of business for a month at a time or whatever. But he spent most of his time in Britain. So when he finally came back to stay, back to LA, he reconnected with all of his LA friends that didn't have the opportunity to see him regularly, invited them up sort of one at a time and began to paint their portrait. So he went from landscapes back to portraits in 2013. He had us all sit in the same chair with the same drape for a background on a little platform stage. So they were sitting up a little bit. And at this point, he's 75, 77 years old. And so he's painting us one at a time. And over the next 2.5 years, he painted 90 portraits of folks like me, close friends, his housekeeper, the housekeeper's son, the guy who washes his car, the cook, studio assistants, Larry Gagosian, the art dealer in New York, Frank Gehry, the architect, just people he knew in his orbit until he had finished about 90 of them. There was an exhibition for that work that was being organized at the Royal Academy in London. And there was also simultaneously an exhibition, a one-man show of his, of new paintings to be done at his gallery in New York, Pace Gallery in New York City. So he then began to paint friends. After he painted us individually, he painted friends who came up to the studio to look at the paintings that he had just painted. So here we are hanging out looking at the portraits that he's just painted, some of us having been in some of those portraits. So he began to paint us looking at the portraits. Okay, so they became these group paintings, which is kind of amusing. And then he invited some dancers to come up and mimic the Matisse dance. And so they were literally moving in circles, dancing, 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 while he would sketch quickly on the canvas and then start to paint with them. And we'd all sit around watching this and having a great old time. So as this exhibition for New York was being prepared and finished, there was a bit of a delay because he has a show opening in New York in a couple of weeks. He has a show opening of the portraits in London in a couple of weeks. So there's 2 weeks of nothing to do that David doesn't sit around and do nothing. So one of his studio assistants said, hey, there's this new technology that allows for 3D photographs. And David's like, huh, what? Huh? So what it is David would take his digital camera and he would take pictures of you like this, all the way around, all the way down to your feet, and took about 400 pictures of you, okay? And then that roll of film was put into the computer and a three-dimensional digitized version of you is created. So here he is pushing technology because he has 2 weeks of nothing to do, right? So he then took photographs of the studio. This is the actual studio space that's built on the old tennis court in Hollywood Hills. This corner is true, the door is correct, but and then there's a drape here that's above desks and print drawers and things. And then the studio actually narrows at this end and there's other stuff going on. But so this part is true. And then David began essentially by creating a stage set of the studio, expanding the floor down, and then taking that digitized image and placing it in this space. So that's a chair in the studio, that's a chair in the studio, and that's the only stool in the studio. But by through this process, he could place 10 of them, or 2 of them, or 6 of them, so, and you could twist them, so he could, because, so he could just take that chair and then turn it this way, or turn it that way, or turn it sideways. So he could play, and he could reduce how big it was, depending on where it sat in the room. And by doing that, he put you in the room. I mean, I'm standing here next to this chair, and I can see the room. And because this part of the photograph and this part of the photograph are just as sharp, it's the way your eye sees the room. Your eye sees the room in all corners, naturally that way. So here David really is trying to show you, I mean, no single camera shot could take that picture. It just wouldn't, it would distort. But David creates this notion that you're standing there and your eye sees that corner of the room just as clearly as it sees this chair. So you look at it and you think this is some sort of odd kind of magic is happening, like I need 3D glasses. It's a very 3D image that's essentially done with technology. So he's pushing the technology with it. In fact, in this image, he really tries to hit you over the head with it. In case you didn't get it here, he explains it here. He tells you. So you stand at the edge of this table and you see that edge of the table and Jonathan sitting there, and you see that edge of the table and me sitting there. So this is the way your eye sees the room. You're the point of perspective. You're the point. And the room is the vision. So he's got us pointing the way your eye sees, which is, and then he tells you, perspective should be reversed because otherwise you're outside the picture. This way you're inside the picture. He even says, especially photography DH. He sort of punctuates it. So if you didn't get it here, he really tries to make you get it there by spelling it out. So there we are. So it's terrific to have these, this latest body of work that really shows this kind of anti-perspective perspective that David has been nailing forever. Do you have a question? No.
I do.
Okay.
My art teeth were cut with Piero della Francesca when
Okay.
I lived in Italy back in the 1960s,
Okay.
where I learned perspective.
Correct.
This is the reverse.
That's correct.
It's fantastic.
I tell you that David talks about these guys all the time.
Piero took me into it, but now David's bringing me back out.
It's funny because David's actually done a version of Piero della Francesca where the perspective is twisted. So he believe me, he talks about the old masters. He understands what they were trying to show and replicate, and he tries to explain it more. He tries to take it to another step. I mean, he even proved that the old masters would use lenses or mirrors or camera oscuras to project the image onto a surface to draw so that they got it accurately. And he proved that it could be done. And that even though the art historians don't like his definition, because they refuse to think that they used actually a lens or a tool. I mean, lenses were invented in the 17th century. Lenses existed. So clearly, artists used them as a tool, like a brush, or like a Canon color copier, or like a camera. It's a tool. And David understood that, has always espoused that, and in fact has written a book about it. And there's even a movie called Tim's Vermeer. I don't know if you've ever seen it, but I mean, it's this guy who was a mail carrier or something, I can't remember, he was just a pedestrian dude, who had read David's book about perspective and how the camera oscura allowed Vermeer to make that imagery. And so he tested the theory. And so he set up a camera oscura, set up a canvas, created a Vermeer-like setting, and painted it, just like Vermeer, and it came out perfectly. And he proves David's theory correct. And it's a good movie, you can rent it on Netflix, Tim's Vermeer. It's a real accurate image. Tim's Vermeer. T-I-M, Tim's Vermeer. Tim is just a regular guy who went out to prove David Hockney's theory. And he did, succeeded.
Well, I hope you realize why I asked him to come up, because it's a unique, art critics wouldn't give you the same kind of depth and background with all the personal stuff he does. It's fascinating.